Let's continue our discussion on theories of socialization. Start with looking at social learning theory. Social learning theory understands that the formation of identity is through learned responses to social stimuli. Identity is formed in a societal context as a result of modeling oneself in response to the expectation of others. Behaviors and attitudes develop in response to positive and negative reinforcement. Behavior that is positively reinforced is more likely to be repeated. So let's say that my parents want me to make good grades. And so I do make good grades, and they reward me with maybe permission to drive the car a little bit longer. Maybe I get a little bit more privileges, that type of thing. Okay. Whereas behavior that is negatively reinforced or negative or punishment is not likely to be repeated. So let's say that I don't make good grades, and one of the things that can happen is that my parents may punish me or provide negative reinforcement, such as maybe I am put on punishment, maybe they take away my electronic devices, cell phone, tablet, etc. And so therefore that behavior, as far as making poor grades, would more likely not be repeated. Okay. A major tenet of social learning theory is the principle that positive reinforcement plus the presence of an admired role model makes a particular behavior highly likely. Looking at our big three theories, functionalist, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionist, functionalist theory understands socialization as a way to integrate people into society. It is the way that we internalize social roles and the values of society. This reinforces social consensus because it encourages at least some type of conformity. Socialization is one of the ways to maintain stability. Remember with functionalists is that they're going to look at parts of society in order to figure out how it contributes to the whole. So when they're looking at socialization, they understand that socialization contributes to stability within society. We internalize the norms of our society. We internalize our culture. We know how to operate or function within society, and that allows for this stability. Remember, functionalism is a macro level theory. Conflict theory, on the other hand, would focus on how groups' identity is shaped by patterns of inequality, either in response to opportunity or by resistance to oppression. Having different opportunities may help us understand why women may major in areas that have been traditionally associated as helping professions, and in arts and humanities, and less frequently in math and science. So with conflict theory, once again, it's going to look at society in a whole aspect. So it's going to be a macro level. But one of the things that they would look at is kind of power and coercion. Why do we socialize girls in a certain way? Right? Why does it appear that girls maybe are socialized when it comes to what kind of career fields they get into? This happens within your family. This happens within education. Even within your peer group, you can see this aspect of gender socialization. It also looks at the fact that through socialization, we can understand why some groups may remain underprivileged over time. It could be because of the way that they're socialized. And unfortunately, we're not going to get into the chapter on education, but one of the things that we can see within education is that if we look at certain schools, depending on where those schools are located, we can see the way that children are socialized in those schools. Typically, schools that maybe fall in a lower socioeconomic class, children are socialized based off of potentially the type of jobs that they may get, which may be more routine jobs, that kind of thing, as opposed to schools that are in maybe more middle class or upper middle class, where kids are socialized to think more creatively, to think kind of outside of the box. And so that's one of the things that we can see how socialization can influence kind of what careers people fall into, what kind of opportunities people have, and that kind of thing. We will actually talk more about gender socialization when we get into our chapter on gender. According to symbolic interaction theory, people learn identities and values through socialization process as they learn the social meanings that different behaviors imply. Remember that symbolic interactionism is a micro level theory because it is looking at individuals. It's also looking at the interactions between those individuals and the meanings that those interactions have. Meaning and therefore self, which is personal identity, are socially constructed and sustained. The meanings assigned to something, including one's own identity, is constantly reconstructed as we act within our environment. Cooley, who's seen as a symbolic interactionist, he developed his theory called Cooley's looking glass self. Charles Horton Cooley basically theorized that the looking glass self is a way to explain how a person's concept of self arises through reflection about one's relationship with others. In seeing ourselves as others do, we respond to the expectations others have of us. This means that the formation of self is fundamentally a social process, one based in interaction people have with each other, as well as a human capacity for self-examination. So the development So the development of the looking glass self is how we think we appear to others, how others judge us, and how the first two make us feel. Whether they make us feel proud, whether they make us feel embarrassed, or other feelings that we may have. The looking glass self involves perception and effect, the perception of how others see us and the effect of others' judgments on us. One unique feature of human life is the ability to see ourselves through others' eyes. People can imagine themselves in a relationship to others and develop a definition of themselves accordingly. From a symbolic interactionist perspective, the reflective process is key to the development of the self. So one thing with Cooley's looking glass self is this idea of how we think we appear to others. So let's just say that maybe I appear, or the way I think that others look at me, or I should say appear to others, could be that they maybe see me as intelligent and smart, right? And then how do they judge us? So we want to make sure, so it could be the idea that they judge us as a person that they would go to if they need an answer or that kind of thing. And how do those first two make us feel? They may make us feel like we're smart, right? They may make us feel like, okay, I understand my material, or I have to make sure that I am seen as maybe the smart student. It can also go in a negative aspect too. And if you watch the little clip about Cooley's looking glass self, they will explain that process. So please make sure to watch that. Mead looks at the development of how we start to understand roles in our society. Because Mead says that we don't understand roles in our society until we hit the game stage or the aspect of the generalized other. So according to George Herbert Mead, social roles are the basis of all social interaction. Taking the role of the other is the process of imagining oneself from the point of view of another. The first stage is the imitation stage. Children copy the behavior of those around them. Think of young children pretending to read a book, even though they can't read. We may have all seen where kids mimic like they're reading, or they may mimic doing something. Basically what they're doing is they're copying that behavior, but they have not necessarily associated that with the role. It is not until they get into the play stage where children take on the role of significant others. A child may be pretending to be maybe their mother, and then they may talk to themselves as a mother would. The child begins to develop self-awareness and begins seeing themselves as others do. Still at this stage, they don't understand the whole aspect of the role, or they don't understand the role of the mother or the role of the significant other in regards to themselves. Okay. In the game stage, the generalized other is formed. They acquire a concept of the generalized other, the abstract composite of social roles and expectations. Children begin to comprehend the system of social relationships in which they are located. The children not only see themselves from the perspective of a significant other, but also understand how people are related to them. This is when they start to develop or understand the other roles in society. So it could be the idea that, in the way Mead actually explains this, he does it really well. He talks about being on the baseball field. And he says when you're in this when you're in the game stage, if I am the pitcher, I have to know the roles of everyone that's playing on that baseball team. So I have to know the role of the first baseman, the shortstop, third baseman, the catcher, etc. And I have to be able to take on those roles, because whenever the batter comes up, I even have to know the role of the batter and understand what the batter is going to do. And from there, it helps me to understand those roles in relations to myself. Okay. And then that's the aspect of the generalized other, because I can understand the social roles and the social expectations that come with those roles. The other thing Mead talks about is how the self is socially constructed through the expectations of others. Mead says that the self has two dimensions. You have the I and the me, and the I is the unique part of the individual's personality, the active, creative, and self-defining part. The me is the passive, conforming self, the part that reacts to others. In each person, there is a balance between the I and the me, very similar to the tension between the id and the superego from Freud. In Mead's version, the identity is always emerging. It is not fixed compared to Freud, where with Freud, your identity is fixed in childhood. Now we'll discuss age and life in the life course. Sociologists use the concept of life course to describe and analyze the connection between people's personal attributes, roles, and life events, as well as the social and historical aspect of those events. Childhood is considered a distinct stage of life, but this has only been the case for the past 2 or 3 centuries in the Western world, and it isn't the case in some cultures today where children are thought of as little adults. In some cultures, children don't experience the leisure and playtime that Americans associate with childhood. Instead, children take on socially necessary roles in society. They may work. In respect, childhood today isn't the ideal we think it is. We often remark that children are too busy with activities and that they are exposed too early to life's difficulties, or that they grow up too fast. During childhood is when one establishes their initial identity and values. The family is an extremely influential source of socialization, but experiences in schools, peer relationships, sports, religion, and the media have a profound effect. Much of socialization is learned in early childhood, and it may take place through games and play. What children observe of the adult world has an enormous influence, as illustrated by research which reveals that how many adult child abusers were themselves victims of child abuse. Adolescence has been thought of as a separate phase in the life cycle. It wasn't until the early 20th century that this category of adolescence emerged. It emerged as a particular phase in life when formal education was extended to all social classes. Adolescence can be a time filled with conflict and confusion, because you're not necessarily seen as a child, yet you're not viewed as an adult. But society expects adolescents to act like adults, but they are denied many of the privileges extended to adults. They can't vote until they're 18 years old. In some places, they're not allowed to get married until they're 18. In addition, they can't drink until they're 21. Patterns of adolescent socialization vary significantly with race, gender, and social class. For example, young people from socially economic privileged backgrounds see activities as more like play than work, while those young persons from less privileged backgrounds are more likely to define their activities as work. Adult socialization is a process of learning new roles and expectations in adult life. It is building on the identity formed during childhood and adolescence. More than at earlier stages in life, adult socialization involves learning behaviors and attitudes appropriate to specific situations and roles. Becoming a full adult has taken longer than before. Young people are in school longer, they wait longer to get married, and delay entering the labor force. This exposes that adulthood is more complex and involves more task and effort than in the past. Thus, it takes longer.